Hi, Ken Spiro here, broadcasting from the Holy City, the Jewish quarter of Jerusalem. I just want to thank Project Inspire for allowing me to participate in MindFlex mini-series. And I'm going to be doing a series of presentations of mine that basically the theme we're going to call it is God's plan for human history and the Jewish people's role in the story. We're going to be doing 3 classes. Today we're going to start out with a class which is based on the first book I wrote, World Perfect, which is focusing on the Jewish impact on civilization, the impact of monotheism and morality. And for this, we're going to be watching a PowerPoint presentation, which I will be narrating as we go. So I'm going to go to share screen here and hopefully find our PowerPoint. Where is it? Okay, we are ready to begin. So to create this presentation, I brainstormed with about 1,500 people, Jews, non-Jews, all different backgrounds and affiliations. Let's come up with a list of values we'd like to see in as perfect a world as humanly possible. And I condensed it down into the following values. Number 1, the value of life, the right to be alive, most basic of all values. Number 2, world peace, a world where there's no more wars, where everyone gets along harmoniously. Number 3, equal justice, a world where everyone is treated equally before the same set of laws. Number 4 is education, a world where everyone is functionally literate as a way of achieving their potential and contributing in a meaningful way to the world. And last but not least, huge category, social responsibility, people taking care of the world, whether we're talking about crime, poverty, environmental issues, animal rights, health issues, you name it. So here we have our 5 basic values. When I'm teaching an audience live, I say, look around the room. You know, how many of you guys think we should have these values in the world? And everyone raises their hand. And I always say, this might be the only time you ever see a room full of Jews agreeing on anything. And it's not just Jews. Anyone who sees this list has an immediate recognition. This is the way the world should be. We don't have to think, should there be value of life? Should people take responsibility for the world? Should there be equality? It's almost as if we're born with these values kind of ingrained, like programmed into our brains, like when you buy a computer or a phone, it comes with basic operating software. So the first part of the presentation is we're going to get in a time capsule and go back to the ancient world to see what did they think of these values. Now, obviously, we can't look at every single civilization that's lived in the last 6,000 years. That would take like months, and I only got an hour to do this in. So I chose to focus primarily, but not exclusively, on the great foundation cultures of Western civilization. When we think about the ancient world in the West, the great cultures, who do we think of? We think of basically Greece and Rome. And we know that Greece gave us so much of our conception of philosophy and the aesthetic and art and architecture, empirical science, and Rome with their concepts of government, engineering, law, modern armies. And obviously, many other civilizations contributed. And even if we don't have time to look at all of them, we don't have to, because one of the things I discovered when I was researching my book on this topic, called World Perfect also, is that culture, just like it does today, varies tremendously from place to place, how people dressed, what they ate. But values are more or less the same everywhere we look in the ancient world. There's no big differences. So with that introduction in mind, let's get in our time capsule, travel back to the ancient world, beginning with value of life, and let's see what did they think of those values. Remember, our goal is to see, where do we get the values from? What's the source? Okay, so to begin at the beginning, a couple of examples to illustrate how different is the idea of value of life in the ancient world. So, what's the most common form of population control practiced by virtually every single civilization we know of in antiquity? And the answer is infanticide. Killing of newborn babies is a universal practice in the ancient world, not just to control population, but also for sex selection. If you were a boy or a guy in the ancient world, you were lucky, because in the ancient world, boys were generally valued and girls were often considered disposable. And it wasn't just done by the baby disposal squad. Immediately after birth, in a place like ancient Greece, the unwanted child would be taken by the parents, stuffed into a clay jar, and thrown into the garbage, or dropped down a well to drown, or be left out in a rock in the woods to be eaten by a wild animal or die of exposure. And this wasn't something that was considered to be cruel or unusual. It was considered to be completely normal and acceptable. Here's a Roman writing to his wife 2,000 years ago. He says, "Know that I am still in Alexandria, and I ask and beg of you to take good care of our baby son. And as soon as I receive payment, I will send it up to you. If you deliver of a child, if it is a boy, keep it. If it is a girl, discard it." Now, today we're very desensitized to, most things because of the internet, and there's very little standards, but we're still horrified about, God forbid, hearing about the killing or injuring of a child or a baby. Not so in the ancient world. You could talk about dumping your baby down the sewer like you could talk about the weather. That's how normal and acceptable it was. So bye-bye, baby. Another shocking example of the different attitude towards value of life is killing people for religious reasons, human sacrifice, which was pretty much universal in the ancient world, although practiced to very varying degrees. Meaning some cultures did it rarely. The Greeks and Romans didn't do that much human sacrifice for religious reasons. Some cultures did it daily. Some cultures sacrificed prisoners or slaves. When the emperor of China died thousands of years ago, they would behead hundreds of prisoners at his funeral. When Genghis Khan, the great Mongol conqueror of Asia, died in the 13th century, he was buried with 40 virgins and 40 horses. But probably here's a gruesome example. This is an Inca girl. This is going back to Central American civilization, South American in this case, excuse me, found in the Andes Mountains. She's one of many young girls, children who were offered. She's not a prisoner or slave. By the way, she was killed over 500 years ago. Incredibly well preserved because she was literally frozen at the top of a mountain. But she was given by her parents, drugged and strangled and buried at the top of a mountain as an offering to the mountain gods. But the worst example I can think of killing people for religious reasons are the Aztecs. If you've been to Mexico City is huge. It's like 20 million people. The center of the original Mexico City was a lake with an island in it, the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan. The Aztecs basically went to war primarily to capture people alive, to schlep them back to their capital city, to drag them up this 150-foot high pyramid, and to rip out their hearts while they were still beating. And they did this to up to 1,000 people a week, because they believed if the blood stopped flowing, the world would cease to exist. It's human sacrifice on a scale that is absolutely mind-blowing. But the worst example I could think of the very different attitude towards value of life in the ancient world than we have today is killing people for entertainment, blood sport. Today we have blood sport, like mixed martial arts and boxing, but there's limits to the violence. You're not supposed to actually kill someone. But occasionally it happens accidentally. But in the ancient world, many cultures went all the way and actually killed people. The Aztecs who we just saw, they had a version of soccer or football, if you're European, where at the end of the game, the entire winning team was sacrificed to the gods. The winning team didn't pay to make it to the playoffs in Aztec sports. But when you think about blood sport in the ancient world, who do we think about? The Romans. In over 200 locations throughout their empire, the Romans built these massive circular arenas called amphitheaters. Certainly one of the largest and the most famous is this one, the Colosseum in Rome. This is, by the way, a mere skeleton of it. It was completed in the year 80 of the Common Era. This is what it looks like today after it was pillaged of all of its marble and everything. But look at the size of it. Again, it was the world's first astrodome. 2,000 years ago, the roof could go off and on it. By the way, the entire center of the stage can be mechanically lowered and filled with water in less than 15 minutes so boats could sail in it. They could put in fake trees and rocks like a Hollywood movie set. They could raise up to 1,000 people at a time to the floor in elevators. What was it used for? By the way, free. It was always free entrance, free meat, free wine. Can you imagine that? Like an American football game with free beer? You want a really scary thought? British football game with free beer. But 50,000 men, women, and children would come. The first act of the day was the Romans brought thousands of exotic animals from around their empire, lions and tigers and bears, and watched them rip each other to shreds, sometimes up to 1,000 animals a morning. Animal rights people would have gone nuts, but they would have been act number 2, which was feeding people to animals. But then in the afternoon, along with chariot races, the biggest sporting event in the Colosseum was gladiators, prisoners or slaves who fought to the death in front of thousands of screaming fans. You can even see some of the scenes here from the movie Gladiator, which actually was pretty well done in terms of the story was a lot of fiction, but the recreations of the Colosseum were pretty amazing. And they didn't just use men, they used women, children, blind people, dwarves, anything for the sake of entertainment. The most sophisticated civilization in the ancient world was also the most brutal. And we shouldn't think, by the way, that there's a connection between culture, law and order, technology, and morality. There is none in human history. Sometimes the most culturally advanced law and order, technologically sophisticated civilizations are the most brutal. Doesn't mean you could walk around Rome just killing people in the streets. They love law and order. But when you look at the ancient world, guys, we see for many different reasons, the most basic of all of our values, value of life, is basically absent. Radically different. Moving on to number 2, which is world peace. And today, everyone wants peace. When I was a little kid, it was the Vietnam War. People used to wear these buttons that said, war is not healthy for children and other living things. It's pretty clear that war isn't healthy for anyone. It's pretty clear that war is the most destructive pastime that the human race participates in. Think about it. How much money does the world spend on weapons, armies, defense budgets per year? It's an incredible number, by the way. It's about $1.5 trillion, of which the United States spends more than half of that. The US spends more on its defense budget than the next 15 countries in the world combined. $1.5 trillion. Imagine what you could do with all that money if there weren't wars to fight, armies to arm, weapons to buy, how much food, housing, medicine, clean water. Thousands of children die every day in Africa from diseases related to not having clean water. What, we just figured this out now? They had smart people in the ancient world. They had Confucius and they had Plato and Socrates. Come on, if we know that war is destructive and wasteful today, they certainly knew it thousands of years ago. But if we know it today and they knew it then how come 6,000 years of human history is 6,000 years of warfare? Why is there so much war in human history? People jokingly say, what does war stand for? We are right, W-A-R. But if you ask the anthropologists, the historians, they basically give you the following explanations for why there's war. Well, number one reason, you could have fighting over a water hole, but once you get past survival and scarce resources, greed is the number one reason. Taking what's not yours by force. Obviously land, women, gold, silver, cattle. Number 2 reason was the law of the jungle, survival of the fittest. The lion's on top of the food chain because he eats everyone and no one eats him. He doesn't say to the gazelle in Africa, you had a rough day, rest by the water hole, I'll go chase a zebra today. He says, if I catch you, your lunch. That's how animals behave. That's how empires behaved. You think Rome ever respected any country's borders? The only people the Romans didn't conquer, like the Persians, were people the Romans couldn't conquer. Conquest was natural. Not to conquer was a sign of weakness. And the third reason, think about it. Where's the world's first heroic literature in the West? It's right there on the board, the screen, the Iliad. Go read that book again by Homer. It's the Trojan horse story. It's one giant battle scene with occasional breaks for long speeches. Because the hero, by definition, is the guy who's a warrior. The guy who kills the most and the greatest opponents. He gets the honor, the glory, and the power when he's alive, and he becomes a legend after he's dead. To be a warrior is the thing for guys to do throughout all human history. I say guys specifically because if women ran the world, there is no question it would be a very different world. A woman comedian once said, when a woman gets depressed, she eats or she shops. When a man gets depressed, he invades another country. And it's glorified throughout all human history. Look what Wallace Caldwell of Columbia University writes. War, therefore, is in the mind of the poet the chief business of men from youth to age, meaning it's the thing to do. But he regards as the special flower of youth, the glorification of war, the glamour and glory of battle, are subjects of the finest words and pictures. But to be fair, the Romans had a period of 200 years called Pax Romana. What's Pax in Latin? Peace. 200 years peace. The Romans never had 2 years of peace. So what was the Roman idea of peace? We conquer the world, we have peace. Come on. Today we'd call that aggressive, colonialist, expansionist, imperialist behavior. Back then that was called peace. I firmly believe you could beam yourself back to the Roman Senate 2,000 years ago and say, hey guys, you know what peace is going to be in the 21st century? That superpower countries like America don't gobble up their neighbors. By the way, America, United States could take Canada, Mexico, and all of South America in a week if they wanted to militarily. But that countries just don't do that because it's just not done. They would have needed Prozac. That's how depressed they would have been. Because these guys lived for war. And when you look in human history, you see that peace is basically the break taken between wars so that civilizations and empires could rearm and fight again. Otherwise, like the value of life, it's absent. Okay, moving along. How about equal justice? Now, today we take this for granted. And we should appreciate, first and foremost, we all come from liberal democracies, so we take it as a given. We should appreciate, by the way, that the true power of a democracy is not so much whether you vote or not, but whether there's a system of laws, like in America, the Constitution, that no one is above. Everyone is subject to the exact same laws. We take that for granted. But if we beam ourselves back in time, let's go back to the ancient world. Look at the guy on the right side of your screen here in the blue. We'll call him Joe Average Ancient Guy. Where is Joe Average Ancient Guy on the socioeconomic ladder? Okay, he's at the very bottom. What do we call him? A peasant or a serf. That's a term we associate with feudal Europe of 1,000 years ago. But feudal systems exist everywhere at all time in human history. 1,000 years ago in Europe, the vast majority of the population are this guy. What does he do for a living? Just like this guy's doing in the picture here. He's farming. Does he own the land he's farming? Usually not. But even if he owns a little piece of land, who's he paying most of what he harvests in taxes to? This guy, Joe Lord. And you know, with an outfit like this man has zero plans to do any manual labor. And what gives Joe Lord the right to lord over, what gives Joe Lord the right to lord over all these peasants? Is he elected by him? No way. The golden rule. What's the golden rule? He who has the gold makes the rules. Birth and wealth are the sole criteria for leadership in the ancient world. And between that teeny tiny elite of the nobility and all those masses, is there equality before the law? There's institutionalized inequality, with the nobility being above the law and everyone else being at their mercy and having no rights. So when you look at this world, you see basically tremendous inequality. And this is the reality. And of course, the ultimate elite are kings, monarchs, a pharaoh, a Caesar, anyone like this in the ancient world. When you go back to, if you look at the guy on the right, Pharaoh there, 4,500 years ago, you have no idea how powerful this guy was. He was literally considered a living god. By the time you get to the guy in the middle, who is one of the great Renaissance kings of Europe, Henry VIII, in the 16th century, he's no longer a living god, but he rules by divine right. What's divine right of kings? God made me king, and if you don't like it, like Alice, the Queen of Hearts says to Alice in Wonderland, off with your head. So tremendous inequality permeates all of human history. But to be fair, where's the world's first democracy? Where's the word even come from? It's a Greek word, opa. Demos kratos, the people govern. Ancient Greece, which city-state? Athens. And by the way, Athenian democracy was far more direct and efficient than the democratic systems of the Western world today. In a democracy, do you vote directly in America for anything? No, it's representational democracy. Congressmen and women, senators, even the president, electoral college. But back in ancient Greece, in Athens, citizens voted directly on everything. But who were citizens who could vote directly? Men with land. A couple thousand adult men with land were the only people who had political rights and the right to vote. It was an oligarchy, a power elite. Everyone else, women, freedmen, artisans, slaves, aliens, were completely disenfranchised. If you could beam yourself back to the oligarchy that ran Athens 2,500 years ago and say, hey guys, you know what equal justice is going to be in the 21st century? That everyone, man, woman, rich, poor, black, white, everyone will be treated equally before the same set of laws. They would have shaken their heads and said, you're absolutely out of your mind. Henry Phelps Brown of Oxford explains. He says the Greeks distinguished strongly between different types of persons and thought it only proper to treat them differently. This inequality of treatment they endorsed in the name of justice, an endorsement that with Aristotle included the justification for slavery. Only those men were citizens who had certain qualifications. Beyond them, it was taken for granted, were all women, but also farmers, laborers, mechanics, freedmen, slaves, and aliens. So another value, gone. Moving along. education. Now, we take this for granted because we assume in all liberal democratic countries in the modern world, government has an obligation to educate the population free of charge to a certain minimum level in America, 12th grade. We take it for granted that government not only has an obligation, but the government also would want to do so. Why? What do you gain by educating your population? You get a developed first world country. One of the big dividing factors, separating factors between the first and the third world is the average level of literacy and education of the population in general. So come on, the Greeks, they loved wisdom. The Romans, look at how organized their armies were. These guys must have had a great public school system. That's what we might think. But if we go back to Joe Average ancient guy again, look at him, he's got the torn leggings. What percentage of people do you think historians estimate on average were literate in the ancient world? I'm talking about for a period of many, 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 many centuries on average. People throw out numbers, 5%, 10%, 4%. The actual number is shockingly low. The actual number is 0.1%. This is the average rate of literacy assumed by most historians until about 500 years ago, the Protestant Reformation and the printing press, which means on average for the vast majority of human history, 1 in 1,000 people could read. Why are the rates of literacy so incredibly low? So if you ask the experts, the historians, they'll tell you, number one reason, think about it, is, and this is a good point, if you come from a first world country and you have a house, not a shack, a shed, a hut, but a house, indoor plumbing, running water, electricity, a kitchen and a fridge that are full of food that you don't eat at all because you're worried about your weight. You have any idea what a luxury it is in human history to worry about eating too much or weighing too much? And you got a 9-to-5 job with weekends, vacation, health plan, retirement benefits. You got your teeth in your mouth past the age of 30 and you live to see your grandchildren. You have a standard of living that not only exceeds the vast majority of people who've lived throughout thousands of years of human history. You have a standard of living that exceeds billions of people in the world today. You know, a billion people on the planet don't even have a toilet. Think about it. What was the daily goal of the average ancient peasant thousands of years ago? The answer is survival. And before modern science and technology and medicine, you had horrendous rates of disease, plagues, wars, famine. Even giving birth was a dangerous thing. Up until the 18th century in industrialized England, half the children died by the age of 2. And if the name of the game is survive, what do your kids have to do as soon as they're old enough to start doing it? The answer is work. Child labor, which is universal, ubiquitous in the ancient world and the third world today. What do you mean, send my kid to school? We starve. So number one reason is people just were too much in survival mode to be able to even think about educating themselves or their children. Number two reason, think about it. If you think about who in the 60s or Occupy Wall Street or what's going on today now with Black Lives Matter and all the political events we've recently had, who's at the forefront of pushing all of this? Students. I think that specific girl might be at the forefront. I wouldn't want to mess with her. But students, why students? Because they're young and idealistic and educated and empowered. And you put those two things together and you have a very difficult group of people to control. And in the non-democratic ancient world, people figured out pretty fast the best way to keep things stable was to keep people stupid. William V. Harris of Harvard explains, the written culture of antiquity is in the main restricted to a privileged minority. It should be obvious that in Greece, and to an even greater extent in the Roman Empire, the illiteracy of the masses contributed to the stability of political order. The disturbances caused by the spread of literacy, on the other hand, have been numerous and varied. The Greeks and Romans would have become very different people if per impossible that achieved mass literacy. So what we see is whether because of just having to survive or deliberate government policy, and usually it was a combination of both, virtually no one in the ancient world could read. So another value, gone. That's actually my graphic artist's graduation photograph. There's his cameo appearance in our PowerPoint presentation. Moving on to, last but certainly not least, is social responsibility. And this one is pretty quick to do because there basically wasn't any in the ancient world. Today we take for granted that in any highly developed Western liberal democracy, there's going to be social welfare infrastructure. If you're hungry, if you're homeless, government will help. It's not a perfect system, but it's government's obligation to help. Do you realize that almost all social welfare that exists in the Western world today appeared in approximately the last 200 years? Before that, you had virtually nothing. 2,000 years ago, in a place like Rome, if you were hungry and homeless and didn't have family to help, tough die. The government would do nothing for you. And today we have this idea of international social responsibility. If there's a humanitarian tragedy, a famine, a plague, a tsunami, an earthquake, there's all kinds of organizations and countries that send relief workers. We have Doctors Without Borders, International Monetary Fund, United Nations peacekeeping forces. You think you had any of this in the ancient world? Can you imagine asking Rome for a peacekeeping force? That's a pretty scary thought. What were leaders in the non-democratic ancient world interested in? It was primarily one word. It began with the letter P, and it was not the word peace. The answer is power. Preserving it, passing it on, and ideally increasing it. Remember Genghis Khan we talked about in Value of Life? One of the greatest conquerors in human history? Look at his vision of what is meaningful in this world. The greatest happiness is to vanquish your enemies, to chase them before you, to rob them of their wealth, to see those dear to them bathed in tears, to clasp to your bosom their wives and daughters. A true humanitarian visionary. Another value, totally gone. So what are we left with? A very different vision of the ancient world than we may have gotten in our 6th or 7th grade world history overview. And please don't get me wrong. I'm not saying everyone in the ancient world was vicious, cruel, heartless, and selfish. And no, the vast, vast, vast majority of people throughout human history are just minding their business and not hurting anyone. And don't get me wrong. I'm not saying good stuff, good ideas and technology didn't come out of the ancient world. It did. We all make use of it today or build on it. But what I am saying is this beautiful vision of values, which everyone has bought into today, is the ideal utopian vision, is not a byproduct of even the greatest, most sophisticated civilizations of antiquity that played such a huge role in shaping our modern world, especially the Western world. So we're left with this big question: where do we get these values from? So there's a British historian by the name of Paul Johnson, and he wrote a book in 1987 called The History of the Jews, which I was recommending for a long time until I wrote a better one, of course, Crash Course in Jewish History. Ask my mother, she will absolutely agree with that one. But in the epilogue of Paul Johnson's book, he does a beautiful job of answering it. This quote is so beautiful, I have to share it with you. One way of summing up 4,000 years of Jewish history is to ask ourselves, what would have happened to the human race if Abraham had not been a man of great sagacity? That means sage-like, wise, or clever. Or if he had stayed in Ur and kept his higher notions to himself, and no specific Jewish people would have come into being. Certainly the world without the Jewish people would have been a radically different place. Humanity might eventually have stumbled upon all the Jewish insights, but we cannot be sure. All the great conceptual discoveries of the human intellect seem obvious and inescapable once they have been revealed, but it requires a special genius to formulate them for the first time. The Jews had this gift. Pay special attention to what he says now. Keep in mind the list that I got from the people my audiences when I was creating this presentation. To them, meaning the Jews, we owe the idea of equality before the law, both divine and human, the sanctity of life and the dignity of human person, of individual conscience and so of personal redemption, of collective conscience and so of social responsibility, of peace as an abstract ideal, and love as the foundation of justice, and many other items which constitute the basic moral furniture of the human mind. Without the Jews, it might have been a much emptier place. Above all, the Jews taught us how to rationalize the unknown. The result was monotheism and the three great religions which profess it. It is almost beyond our capacity to imagine how the world would have fared if they had never emerged. And I always say it's a good thing that a non-Jew wrote this, because if some rabbi had wrote it, we wouldn't believe it. But what Paul Johnson is saying is not unique to Paul Johnson. In the course of researching my book, I literally came across dozens of presidents, prime ministers, philosophers, historians, thinkers. They all basically say the same thing, that we, the teeny tiny Jewish people who shouldn't even be here, we civilized the world. We gave the world basically their moral, ethical vision of values. Now don't get me wrong, I'm not saying Jews are all perfect. No, there's righteous Gentiles and there's plenty of rotten Jews running around in this world. And I'm not saying the Jewish people invented all the beautiful ideas in the world either. It's not true. But there is no question that we, the teeny tiny Jewish people, have had a monumentally transformative impact monumentally transformative impact on the collective conscience of humanity. As to why that is so, we'll get to in just a few minutes. But what I want to do is run you back through our list of 5 basic values and show you how in every single one of these, Judaism is truly revolutionary. So to begin at the beginning, value of life. The clearest distinction between the Jewish concept of value of life and everyone else's can best be seen by looking at number 6 of the 10 Commandments. What's number 6 of the 10 Commandments? Don't murder. Which, by the way, is always mistranslated as thou shalt not kill. There's a difference we'll look at. But Judaism taught the world that human life has intrinsic value. We taught the world you don't kill babies. God doesn't need human blood. God forbid you kill a human being for entertainment. Why, by the way, is it lo tirtzach, don't murder, and not lo taharog, don't kill? Because Judaism are not pacifists. There's situations you're allowed to take another human life in. You're allowed to defend yourself, even if it means killing another human being. There's a death penalty in Jewish law. But because anyone who knows Jewish law knows it's incredibly difficult to actually mete out the death penalty to anyone. This was most beautifully stated by a wonderful quote from the Talmud, which actually appears in the movie Schindler's List. You know, Oskar Schindler, the only member of the Nazi party recognized as righteous amongst the nations at Yad Vashem. But remember, at the end of the movie, they make this ring that Schindler Jews. He saved the lives of 1,200 Jews. They make him this gold ring, and this is what's inscribed on the inside of the ring. He who saves one life, it's as if he saves an entire universe. The infinite value of every human life. Truly revolutionary. How about world peace? I mean, what's the word for peace in Hebrew? Shalom. It's a word that we Jews obsess on. The word shalom appears 240 times in the Hebrew Bible. And it's so basic to our Jewish worldview. It's how you greet your fellow human being. You say, shalom, hi, how you doing? But it's obsessed on by all the great Jewish thinkers of how central is the concept of peace, not just to Judaism, but to the human race. By the way, the greatest proof of the Jewish obsession with peace doesn't come from Jewish sources. What's the world body supposedly dedicated to bringing peace to the world, unfortunately, when it's not obsessively condemning Israel? Sorry, I had to add that in there. But the United Nations, which in theory is a good organization. In practice, it hasn't maybe worked out exactly so great. But if you go to UN General Assembly headquarters in Manhattan on the East River to Dag Hammarskjöld Plaza, you will see a wall outside the building. On that wall, it's called the Isaiah Wall because it's a quote from the great prophet Isaiah. The beautiful quote about beating swords into plowshares and spears into pruning hooks and nation not making war against nation anymore. Why is this quote of all quotes the motto of the UN? Because the founders of the League of Nations that then became the United Nations know that the people who first introduced the idea of peace as the ideal permanent state for the human race are the Jewish people. Equal justice. What's the word for justice in Hebrew? There's a bunch of different words. There's mishpat, but the word I'm looking for is tzedek. By the way, what's the word for charity in Hebrew? Tzedakah. The root of charity is the word justice. And by the word tzedek appears 120 times in the Hebrew Bible. It's interesting. Tzedek 120, shalom 240. Exactly half. Maybe we need twice as much justice to get a little peace. But out of the obsession with this word will come a concept that will totally transform the world's idea about what equal justice is truly about. 2 quotes from Leviticus 19:15. And by the way, if you want to see where the Grand Slam home run hit list of the fundamental values of Western liberal civilization come from, it's Leviticus chapter 19. But it says in Leviticus 19:15, you shall do no unrighteousness in judgment. You shall not respect the person of the poor, nor honor the person of the mighty. But in righteousness you shall judge your neighbor. What does that mean in simple English? It means no favoritism either way, not towards the rich or the poor. Equality before the law. Today it's like, duh. The reason we don't appreciate this is we don't have the tremendous inequality that we had in the ancient world. We don't have these all-powerful monarchs that we used to have who are living gods, who can cut our heads off, who are above the law. Today we think of a reigning monarch, we think she's the longest reigning and one of the oldest monarchs in history, Queen Elizabeth II. I mean, you compare her to one of these guys. Look, this woman has no real political power. She pays taxes. She gets no nachas from her kids. This is not a real monarchy. But you compare these guys, these all-powerful monarchs, to a Jewish king, you see a huge difference. By the way, you know, every Jew is supposed to write a Torah scroll. Today, most people pay a scribe to do it for them or put a letter in a scroll. But in proper Jewish law, everyone writes a Torah scroll for themselves. A Jewish king has to write one Torah scroll like all Jews and a second scroll, a mini one that he has to wear attached to his arm. Can you imagine walking around with a Torah scroll attached like with a Velcro strip to your arm? Why do you have to do that? It says exactly why in Deuteronomy 17. Dvarim. And when the king sits on the throne of his kingdom, he'll write a copy of the Torah and it'll be with him and he'll read from it. Why? So he will learn to fear the Lord his God, to keep all the words of his Torah and do its statutes. The king has to know as a king of kings, God, and no one is above the law. And by the way, this quote from Deuteronomy, not Magna Carta, 1215, King John of England, Runnymede. This quote is the first example of limiting the power of a monarch. And you also have to appreciate that the ideal biblical government was not a pure monarchy, nor was it a theocracy where the religious leaders are running the country. It was a mixed system, division of powers, checks and balances. Great point of trivia as we're coming up to the 4th of July very soon. That the founding fathers of the United States, who were strongly influenced by Judaism and the Bible in many ways, based the US government on the biblical model. They just replaced a king with a president. But in biblical Israel, chief political leader was the king. Chief religious leader, the high priest, not the king. That's a huge innovation. Chief religious leader is the king is not the high priest. The chief religious leader is the high priest, the Kohen Gadol. And you have kings, separate jobs. But where did the judicial legislative power rest? In which body? In a court of 71 judges, which was called the Sanhedrin. And these guys were like the Supreme Court, the Congress, and the Senate all rolled up into one. They adjudicated, they legislated, they had tremendous power. Anywhere else in the world to have that power, what did you have to have? The golden rule, birth and wealth. To be on the Sanhedrin, what did you have to have? Interesting, a whole bunch of criteria. Number one is married with kids. Like, why that? Because being a parent, every human being is someone's child. Being a parent teaches you mercy, right? The fact that you let your kids live through, being teenagers is a sign you definitely learn mercy. Like Roseanne Barr, the comedian, once said, now that I have teenagers, I realize why some mammals eat their young. But what else did you have to have? You had to have encyclopedic knowledge of everything. Not on your smartphone, This is what I call a smartphone. It knows everything. There it is. It knows everything. We don't know anything. You had to have it in your brain. And not only that, you had to have unquestioning integrity. Political integrity today is like an oxymoron. What's an oxymoron? Like two words that don't go together. Like military intelligence, jumbo shrimp, like the Brits would say. Oxymoron, American culture. And then I would shoot back, oh yeah, like British cooking. Okay, that kind of stuff. But it's a very unique system. It's a meritocracy. The best person for the job gets the job regardless of position in society. Let's move on. Keep going. Education. This one we can basically skip because every Jewish parent actually believes that there are 11 big commandments. What's number 11? Thou shalt go to college. And the rabbis in tractate in the Talmud, higher education, that's a joke, say preferably Ivy League with full scholarship up to PhD. That's called chidur mitzvah, or glorifying the commandments. But it brings us to a very unique status that we Jewish people have in history. Jews are history's only literate nation. We're not the only nation that liked wisdom. The Greeks like wisdom, the Chinese like wisdom, but they didn't actually teach their population anything. Jews are the only people to actually educate their population en masse. The smallest, poorest Jewish communities had free education systems far older and far more comprehensive than the greatest empires in the ancient world. And this goes back to the radically different idea that Judaism has always had about education. Everyone else is saying keep people ignorant to control them. Judaism is saying educate people to empower them. Look at what Maimonides, the great Jewish scholar who was born in Cordoba in Spain in 1135 and died in Cairo in 1204. And he codified all of Jewish law and philosophy in his amazing Mishnah Torah, 14-volume work. Look what Maimonides says. Appoint teachers for the children in every country, province, and city. In any city that does not have a school, excommunicate the people of the city until they get teachers for the children. If they don't, destroy the city, because the world exists only because of the breadth of children studying. Destroy the city? No Jewish community was ever destroyed because it didn't have a school, because the Jewish people literally had public education way before anyone else thought of it. And if you're thinking, yeah, Maimonides, Rabbi, you can't believe what they say about Jews, look at what great medieval Catholic scholar theologian Peter Abelard says about the Jews around the same time as Maimonides. He says, a Jew, however poor, if he had 10 sons, would put them all to letters, not for gain as the Christians do, but for understanding of God's law. And not only his sons, but his daughters. Interesting. Moving along to social responsibility. And this is the other area where Judaism is also unique, because not only are Jews history's only literate nation, Jews are the only people to have highly developed social welfare infrastructure. The smallest, poorest Jewish communities had social welfare infrastructure far older and more comprehensive than anything that exists in the world today. And it goes back to a very basic Jewish point of worldview, which again comes out of Leviticus chapter 19. This one is 19:16. Lo tamod adam re'echa. Don't stand by your neighbor's blood. Which doesn't mean if you see someone bleeding, don't stand in it because you ruin your shoes. It means if you see a human being in distress, physical, emotional, economic, you gotta help. We Jews didn't invent law. Any society, law is the natural outgrowth of any society that doesn't want anarchy. But think of what all legal codes are basically about. It's designed to control, to keep order. Don't murder, don't steal, stop at the red light, pay your taxes, you're a good citizen. Jewish law has that prohibitive side to it, but it also has a unique proactive component. You have to actively do good. Think about it. Today, in almost any country in the world, anywhere, if you see someone in trouble and you don't help, what is your legal status? Nothing. I'm a bystander. I don't want to get involved. It's not my problem. Judaism says, you make one of two choices. You're part of the problem or you're part of the solution. Doing nothing makes you part of the problem, and you have a legal obligation to be part of the solution. Proactively be involved, which is most beautifully stated by probably the three most famous words from the Hebrew Bible in the book of Vayikra, Leviticus 19:18. Again, 19 again. Love your neighbor as yourself. Like, what does that mean? I stand on a street corner with a smiley button on, handing out flowers, telling people to have a nice day. Maybe in LA, that's what it means. But in Jewish law, it means you got to give 10% of your income to charity, whether you like it or not. You have to help the widows, the orphans, the downtrodden, the oppressed. It's not just Jews, it's also non-Jews. It's not just human beings. It's also animals. You guys know the first animal rights law, the first environmental law. It all appears in Jewish law. This whole sweeping vision of proactively taking care of the world, which is part and parcel of Jewish worldview and Jewish communal life everywhere at all times and way before anyone else thought of it. And you guys should appreciate that many of the great modern social thinkers the last century or so, not Jews, will quote something from Judaism or the Bible as their source of inspiration for pushing the notion of proactive social welfare infrastructure on the world. Here's a great example. This is a great social thinker from America in the beginning of the 20th century, Lyman Abbott. He writes, it would be impossible to mention any other people of even a much later age whose law and constitution embodied an ideal so noble as it embodied in Hebrew civil laws, or any people whose history shows the existence of political institutions so essentially just, free, and humane. We Gentiles owe our life to Israel. It is Israel who, in bringing us the divine law, has laid the foundation of liberty. It is Israel who had the first free institutions the world ever saw. When sometimes our own unchristian prejudices flame out against the Jewish people, let us remember that all that we have and all that we are, we owe under God to what Judaism has given us. Now that's a nice quote. So what are we left with? This incredible fact that we, the teeny tiny Jewish people, have had this incredibly transformative impact on humanity's conscience and values. But we're left with a huge question. Like, what is it about us so small that enables us to have an impact so big? And to understand that, we have to look at one more idea. But it's the most important idea. It's the central idea. It's the idea from which all of this comes from, and without it, we have none of it. So besides great, obvious, well-known Jewish contributions to the world, like gilt bagels, junk bonds, leverage buyouts, Einstein, Marx, Freud, 22% of all the Nobel Prizes since 1901, 24% of the Fields Medals in mathematics, 25% of the Forbes list of the wealthiest people on the planet Earth, and all that other great trivia, what is the greatest Jewish contribution to civilization? The answer? One God. One God and one absolute standard of morality. Call it ethical monotheism, call it whatever you like, but there's no question in the realm of spirituality, morality, values, ethics. It is the most transformative idea in human history. It's an idea today, looking back in hindsight, we can see has transformed the world, but it's an idea which thousands of years ago, no one could comprehend. If we jump back to Joe Average Ancient Guy, just one more minute, there he is in the middle, contemplating his world, his spiritual moral world 4,000 years ago. 4,000 years ago, there's no secular. Everyone is religious, but all religions are polytheistic. What's polytheism? Multiple gods. You believed in a world full of gods, and you believe that different gods wanted different things from you. By the way, all cultures and societies, from the most sophisticated to the most primitive, all have codes of behavior, whether they're written down or not. But what are they based on? What the majority wants, what's most expedient, what's easiest to do, what's least expensive. Overpopulation is a problem. Before birth control, the easiest people to get rid of, babies, because they're the least connected to the society. You have a world which was essentially amoral. And because it was amoral, it degenerates into being incredibly immoral, which is why Dostoevsky, the great Russian writer, said, where there is no God, everything is permissible. And which is why you could have a world of tremendous sophistication and technological advancement like the Roman Empire of 2,000 years ago, but a world that is incredibly callous and brutal, because it all comes out of a reality where no one can say in an absolute sense, this is right, this is wrong, this is good, this is evil in an absolute sense, and it ain't a popularity contest. Into this world, almost 4,000 years ago, comes one man, Abraham, out of a place called Ur of the Chaldees. Where's Ur today, by the way? It's Iraq. Everyone knows where Iraq is. Like Ambrose Bierce, who wrote during the American Civil War, said, war is God's way of teaching Americans geography. So we all know where Iraq is. Out of Iraq, almost 4,000 years ago, comes one man who's great for two reasons. A, in a world that's totally lost this relationship with this infinite being. Abraham is a radically transformative, free-thinking super genius who's able to think outside the box and come to the realization there's one infinite creator of the universe. But imagine being the only person in the world to believe in an idea which is radically transformative, totally not, experiential in terms of what you could see, and that no one else wants to listen to, and most people will kill you for even saying. How many of us would have the chutzpah, the nerve, to even whisper to our best friends? That's the greatness of Abraham. He says, I want truth regardless of consequences. I choose to live and, if necessary, to die for the reality of God. Now, Abraham knows a lot better than we know. You don't live for God. You don't die for God. God is infinite. You don't do anything for God. But without relationship with him, we're doomed. We're going to eat each other alive. We're missing the whole purpose of creation. That's what Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad is. That's our shmantra, our Jewish battle cry. God is it, the source of morality and spirituality. And Abraham will therefore, because of this clarity and this commitment, will dedicate himself to a unique mission. But look at the implications of this idea of being made in the image of God. Look at the moral implications. In the very beginning of the Bible, it says we're created, human beings, B'Tselem Elokim, in his image. But God has no image, he's infinite. What does it mean to be created in God's image? What do we have that's godlike? And the answer is we have a soul. What's the word in Hebrew? A nishama, a divine spark, a piece of this infinite, so to speak. Look at the implications of just that idea. If every human being has this divine spark within him or her, this piece, so to speak, of the divine in them, then what does it say about value of life? Every life is infinitely valued, which is why saving a life is like saving a universe. How about equality? If every human being has this soul, this piece of the divine in them, then there's a fundamental value amongst all of us. Like the prophet Amos says in the Bible, has not one God made us all? Are we not all his children? And if you're made in God's image, social responsibility, you have an obligation to act like God. One of the 613 commandments is halachta b'drachav, be like God, go in his ways. What does that mean? I sit in a cloud throwing lightning bolts at people? No, the rabbis say, just as he is kind and merciful, you, made in his image, have to be kind and merciful. We do not appreciate how incredibly transformative these ideas have been because they're so ingrained in our collective consciousness, not just as Jews, but the whole human race. Here's one guy who does, however. Second President of the United States, one of the founding fathers, John Adams. Amazing quote. I will insist the Hebrews have done more to civilize men than any other nation. If I were an atheist and believed in blind eternal fate, I should still believe that fate had ordained the Jews to be the most essential instrument for civilizing the nations. If I were an atheist of another sect, I should still believe that chance had ordered the Jews to preserve and propagate for all mankind the doctrine of a supreme, intelligent, wise, almighty sovereign of the universe, which I believe to be the great essential principle of all morality and consequently of all civilization. They are the most glorious nation that ever inhabited this earth. The Romans and their empire are a bubble in comparison to the Jews. They have given religion to 3/4 of the globe and influenced the affairs of mankind more and more happily than any other nation, ancient or modern. And if you were running for president today, I would definitely be voting for this guy. And again, like I said, he's one of many, many people, presidents, prime ministers, philosophers, historians, thinkers, who all say that same thing. Which brings us to what the job of the Jewish people is. It's not about converting. It's not about conquering. Jews don't have empires. The only Jewish empire in history has probably been Hollywood, and it definitely has not been a source of Jewish values. It's about leading by example, individually and collectively, which brings me to something that every Jew has to be able to articulate, and is such a misunderstood idea: chosen people. The way I explain it simply is, Abraham says to God, God, I choose you. I choose to dedicate my life and the life of my descendants to one mission, to teaching the world about the reality of you and the values that come from relationship with you. And God says back to Abraham, so to speak, you're choosing me, Abraham? I choose you back. You and your descendants, us, the Jewish people. What are we chosen for? We're not chosen for privilege. It may be a privilege to be Jewish, but we're not chosen for privilege. We're chosen for responsibility. What's the responsibility we're chosen for? The word the Jewish world loves to use, overuse, and often misuse is tikkun olam, which translates into fix the world. Like, how's that for a cause? A little bigger than save the whales. But the real job of the Jewish people is Kiddush Hashem, is to live and act in a way. That is the goal. Torah and mitzvot are a means to an end. The goal is to live and act in a way that inspires other people. People are supposed to look at us and say, look at those Jews. Look at how they live. Look at their families, their communities, how they do their business. But what's their secret? So, okay, so we understand that's our role. The last little part of the riddle is, how did we get the world to buy into that? I brought up the image too quickly for you. I should have waited for this now to show you. How did we get the world to buy into that vision? You know, it's not because we were well-loved, popular, and had a big empire. You have to appreciate from the birth of Abraham, for 2,000 years, we exist alone in the world as the only people believing in one God, and everyone thinks we're crazy and is trying to kill us, which is what Hanukkah was about. It was history's first religious ideological war when the pagan Greeks were just trying to destroy not Jews, but Judaism. And after being told we're crazy for 2,000 years, out of Judaism will come two offshoot faiths, Christianity and Islam, which will ultimately convert billions of people who used to be polytheists into a worldview that is essentially Jewish, because every believing Christian and Muslim will tell you there's one God. Okay, the Christian one gets God parts, forget it, put them aside. There's one God, there's one source of morality, that God created the whole world, that God gave the Jewish people a Torah at Mount Sinai, and then he changed his mind and chose us instead. That's a different problem and a different presentation. But that is the greatest transformation in human history in terms of values and spirituality. And how did these values get out to the world and even to places that may not be Christian or Muslim? It's not through religious ideology, it's through political ideology. What has been the fastest growing form of government in the last 200 plus years? And the answer is modern liberal democracy. And if you study the history of modern liberal democracy, I do whole presentations on this, you'll see that the founding fathers, like in America, are a great example, were very, very highly influenced by the notion of one God and absolute morality in their worldview. It's right there in the Declaration of Independence of the United States, 1776. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that amongst these are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. So, ladies and gentlemen, to put it all together and come to a close, if we make a graph of religions of the world, and by the way, being Jewish is also a nation, not just a religion. But no matter what you call us Jews or how you want to label us, we are so small, we don't even appear on the graph. There we are, magnifying glass. No? There we are. 0.2% of the world's population. But if you make a graph of impact on the world, we are right off the top of the chart. Smallest of nations, biggest of impacts. Why did I make this presentation? Because so many Jews, especially younger Jews, think that Judaism is meaningless and irrelevant. Nothing could be further from the truth. We got to have some Jewish pride. Pride is a dangerous word. It doesn't mean walking around thinking I'm superior to you and I'm better than you. But it does mean justifiable self-respect at the historically proven power of Jewish ideas and the Jewish people to transform the world, because it is an undeniable fact that the entire human race is in a completely different place in terms of its values and its vision because of the Jewish people. And as much as the world has moved much closer to those vision than it was thousands of years ago, we ain't quite there yet. We got a little more proactive work to do here. So I'd like to close with a little bit of food for thought in general about what each and every one of us is supposed to do as part of this unique nation to make this vision of values a reality for not just us, but for the entire human race. So just to close, Judaism teaches, number one, that every human being, like a snowflake, is unique. There's something only you can do that no one else can do. Our job in this world is never to compare ourselves to anyone else, because there is no one else like us. Our job in this world is to bring out our own unique potential. But how do you do that? Complicated equipment like a car or computer comes with an instruction manual. We are much more. A human being is much more. That brain and everything, much more complicated. And we also got from our manufacturer in heaven an instruction manual. It's called Torah. The literal translation of Torah's instructions. Torat Chaim, the guidebook for living. Because you can't represent the Jewish people until you know what the Jewish people represents. Ignorance and not anti-Semitism is really the greatest threat to us. And when we become properly educated as Jews, we'll figure out that our job in this world is to be a light. You know, statistically, Jews found and volunteer for more causes and movements than any other people on the planet Earth, by far. I always say Jews for every ism but Judaism. And while I have nothing against a lot of those causes, well, think about what a cause is. A cause is putting a Band-Aid on a symptom of a deeper problem. If we truly want to make the world a better place, we have to change humanity's values. Be a light. And the job of being that light is not just for a couple of outreach organizations, Project Inspire, Aish Torah, other rabbis. It's the collective responsibility of all the Jewish people. We're all like cells in one giant body. As that beautiful little Israeli folk song goes, Kol echad or katanu biyachad or etan. Each of us is one small light, but together we shine bright. Each and every one of us has an obligation to be a proud Jew, to be an educated Jew, to stop focusing on what separates us, but rather on what unites us. This is the great Achilles heel of the Jewish people. I'm Reform, you're Orthodox, conservative, liberal, blah, blah. The people who hate us don't make such distinctions, guys, but to come together and focus the incredible energy and drive to finish the job that Abraham started 3,700 years ago. And I know it sounds like the impossible dream, guys, but I'm telling you, all of Jewish history is impossible. The person who summed this up the best was the first prime minister of Israel, David Ben-Gurion, whose real name was David Green from Plunsk, Poland, who was not a religious Jew, but boy did he know his Tanakh, his Bible, and boy did he know his history. And he has such a good quote. A Jew who doesn't believe in miracles is not a realist. And guys, when we come together as one people, proud, united, using that incredible energy, drive, vision that we have, we'll finally give the world the vision they're waiting for. I am not a prophet. If I was, I'd be working in the stock exchange. But I can tell you one thing, the world is not going to leave the Jewish people alone or the Jewish state until we finish that mission. And when we finally do start moving in that direction, individually and collectively, we will be able to give the world the beautiful vision that they are truly waiting for, which has become the universal utopian vision for the human race, which is that beautiful statement from the prophet Isaiah. The mountain of the Lord's house shall be established on top of the mountains, and it shall be exalted above the hills, and all the nations shall flow unto it. And many people shall go and say, come, and let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, and he will teach us of his ways, and we will walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth Torah, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. And they shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining me, and thanks for joining us at the MindFlex series. I'm going to be back with 2 more classes. If you want to find out more about this topic, you're welcome to get my book online. You can go to my website. You see there, kenspiro.com. I have tons of free content. You can listen, read, and watch, and I can also be contacted through my site. Enjoy the rest of your day and the rest of your learning, and we will hopefully be back soon with more exciting, interesting, and relevant information. Thank you. Bye-bye.